Good evening. Welcome to UCSD's Conversations in Archaeology. My name's Thomas Levy from the Department of Anthropology. Tonight, our guest is Professor Robert McC, formerly of the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, where in addition to being its director, he was also the provost of the university, and most recently, he was the secretary of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. Currently, he's on the faculty at UCSD in the Department of Anthropology. I'd like to give a warm welcome to Professor Adams, who is one of this nation's most distinguished archaeologists. Welcome, Bob.
Thank you.
Bob, how did you get into archaeology?
Well, of course, that was a different time. Colleges and universities were nothing like the kinds of institutions in terms of their place in life at the end of World War II that they are now, and it really didn't occur to me to make a career out of this, but quite unexpectedly an opportunity came to go to the field in connection with what was then a new and radical idea in archaeology, to focus on problems rather than on the recovery of particular antiquities. The problem there was the beginning of agriculture, and I went along. I left a job in a steel mill, in fact, and went out. And in the course of that season, found that it would be just a wonderful way to build a career.
On that project, did you immediately understand that settlement patterns would be an important source for archaeological research?
I don't think so. Settlement patterns were just beginning to become a focus of interest among archaeologists. The real breakthrough in that field was coming just about at that time or a few years later, and I think I began to move in that direction and to move away from the original field of investigation within 2 or 3 years afterwards. But it's been a field that ever since then has been very much on my mind.
Have you done traditional archaeology where you actually go out to these ancient Near Eastern mounds and excavate?
I have. It hasn't been a major activity on my part. I've done it primarily in connection with trying to develop a better understanding of chronology for a particular period where that was important to the study of changing patterns of urbanization and demography and so on. So it's been ancillary rather than central.
Now, just to step back for a moment, I believe you're a member of the McCormick family, which has a...
Well, the unmoneyed end of the family.
Oh, you're the unmoneyed end. Okay. But what made you go out to the steel mills and when presumably you didn't really have to do that after the Second World War?
Well, we all had the GI Bill then, and it was quite possible to be open in your interests and in your ideas of what you were going to do for a later career. And I thought I might want to be a reporter or something, and I thought understanding American life better would make good sense. And I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do. It was an opportunity to participate in heavy industry and to think about it and to mark time in a sense while deciding what to do.
Did that influence your interest in the history of technology?
I'm sure it did. That was a different time in so many ways. I remember the feeling of pride that was in fact common among many of the people who were working in the mills at the plumes of multicolored smoke that were rising from the blast furnaces and so on, as a symbol of sort of the strength of industry and the productiveness of the whole of what was going on in South Chicago, and the notion that this was a source of pollution came along many years after that.
So your field work began back in the late 40s, the early 50s.
The beginning of the 50s,
The
yeah.
beginnings of the 50s. Why were the Iraqis willing to allow you to survey their country and go into these remote areas?
Well, now you're turning to the beginning of surveys, which comes on my part in the mid-50s. I'd finished my degree at Chicago and went to work for the Oriental Institute, and at first it seemed like a continuation of work that had been conducted under older traditions, and the notion of simply connecting the lines between the major traditional sites in order to establish the courses of the ancient rivers that were thought to have been lost forever, buried beneath the rising plain, seemed like a simple way of going forward with an aspect of historical geography that hadn't been looked at. Once we got into it, it turned out to be enormously more complex and exciting than that, but that's where it began. In the course of that first year, the Iraqis, in fact, came to me and indicated that they were planning a major agricultural development in the area east of the capital in Baghdad, and were troubled, in fact, politically troubled. This was still in the days when Iraq was a monarchy, although it was coming to its last years. Politically troubled by the enormous cost of development and by the sense that they were getting from their advisors and engineers that there were enormous expenses for things like salinization that apparently hadn't ever been looked at in antiquity. And why had there been these golden ages when so many of the expensive modern developments weren't even part of it? So they wanted a study that would look at that and that would look at try to evaluate the actual productivity and prosperity of ancient times.
Now, you were working with Thor Jakobsen, who was a noted Orientalist
That's
at
right.
that time. How did your collaboration work? And I know you both published a seminal paper in Science about the salinization of the plains there.
Well, there were two major aspects to that project, and Torkild was primarily responsible for the study of ancient texts of a variety of periods. Clay tablets were the traditional writing material from the beginning of writing in the 4th millennium BC down to almost the end of the pre-Christian era, and he was a specialist in those. But then he also had individuals who working with him who were looking at some of the later, particularly Islamic materials. So that was a textual study that was aimed at looking at economic reports of the effectiveness of fields and observations on the existence of salinity and questions of that kind. My part of the task was to take the area that was to be developed, the Diyala Plains, and do a study of the sequences of change in demography, in urban patterns, in all of the conditions of life as we could detect it from surface survey, beginning to use air photographs. And that was my first major opportunity to work with air photographs.
Now, you collected thousands of pieces of data relating to settlement patterns and so on, and I believe the work came out as a major book, Land Behind Baghdad.
That's right.
And there, while you touch on the beginnings of one of the world's oldest civilization, you show an interest in the later periods as well. Why did you get interested in post-Mesopotamian history, as it were?
Well, it isn't post-Mesopotamian history. Mesopotamia is still there. The history continues. I think basically what I found already in my first span of fieldwork on this subject was that to focus narrowly on a particular period, let's say the rise of cities or the beginnings of agriculture, in the midst of these enormous remains that go on through time for millennia after that, was simply to ignore this trove of data that was so rich, and that it made no sense to me then, and it hasn't ever since, not to take a contextual view, I would call it, to look at the whole pattern as it changes through time, and then to hope to learn from some of the later changes, forces that may have been at work at earlier times when you can't see them so clearly, when they're harder to detect. So I think looking at the whole pattern is really the only way to approach this. I might say also that I'm very uneasy about an approach to any field of ancient history that identifies a particular set of achievements or events or something or other and says, we care about these, we select these as our focus, and that ignores the rest. And I think Iraq has been one might not know it today from the troubles that we're having with Saddam Hussein, but it's been a major source of new ideas and innovations in history, and I think that whole theme is one that I've tried to work on.
But hasn't your work really focused on changes in agriculture? I mean, you've used agriculture as the main lens to monitor change.
I think that's true, although agriculture, I think looking at basic patterns of subsistence and the interactions between the different kinds of people who practice them means that you're also working on nomads and on semi-nomads. So it isn't agriculture only in the sense of field cultivation, but I've always been interested in this, in the sort of material conditions of life, which is what one can hope to find archaeologically, and that obviously then leads you into problems of subsistence.
Following the land behind Baghdad, you produced a series of surveys, additional surveys in the area, and then the Uruk countryside, I believe.
That came next.
That was your next major work. And there you really explain the rise of Mesopotamian civilization, the earliest civilization in the world.
I explained it to my satisfaction. There obviously are many questions, and there's no reason to believe that the processes were the same when civilizations arose elsewhere in Mesoamerica and Peru and Egypt and the Indus Valley and China. But that work was done when I was able to work very closely with a German colleague at German excavations in southern Iraq at really one of the most famous and important of ancient cities, the ancient city of Uruk, which is where the oldest writing that we know seems to have flourished as well as originated.
So you joined the historical record with the settlement pattern data.
Yeah, that doesn't mean, of course, that things are completely cyclical, that you simply recreate dynasties or whatever and can see the process repeating itself endlessly. It's evolving through time as it goes. New institutions are appearing and some are dying out, and obviously the technical base is changing, and the crops are changing, and the density of population is changing, and so on. But all that needs to be put together into a full account.
So in a nutshell, how would you explain the rise of civilization in Mesopotamia?
I think I guess I would put it this way, that it was an area that is seemingly very harsh. It's semi-arid. It poses many constraints, of which this problem of salinity is only one. But it offers extraordinary opportunities once people organize to make use of it. It's the capacity to have different parts of the community doing different things. Cadres of fishermen and cadres of herdsmen and others who are engaged in planting and specialists of various kinds, and to find ways of integrating these groups and making it possible for them to either exchange their own specialized products directly or to have some sort of a redistributive pattern in which they're paying tribute or taxes, and then the stuff is being redistributed to other parts of the community. It's what grows out of organization, which then imposes its own demands and makes possible further crystallization of new institutions and so on. And in effect, I think the challenges were great and the response had to rise to meet those challenges. I guess I would put it in those old Toynbee terms.
Mm-hmm. Now, as your career was developing, there was a major scientific revolution in archaeology in this country called The New Archaeology. And that, of course, argued for the importance of law-like statements of human behavior, laws of cultural development, and so on. The new archaeologists, most of them have disappeared, yet your work continues to have an influence. How come you were not dragged into that controversy? Why does your work remain?
Well, a lot of those folks are still around and still doing very good work. I wouldn't say they've disappeared. But I think I had two differences with the main thrust of that work. Most of it was being done in this country. This was certainly the center of it. And there was not really ever in North America the question of using historical sources. And I've always taken the approach that we're here to use every kind of source we can, whether it's air photographs or excavations or historical documents. And the lack of readiness to cross the barrier between prehistory and history was something I simply couldn't accept. The other respect in which I think there was something fundamentally wrong with the approach that was then taken was that it left very little role for human agency, for the effects of belief and organization and chance and uncertainty, and that the notion of law-like statements of people behaving in ways that were, in a sense, fixed by circumstance, always was one I had a hard time accepting. And I think the whole field has tended to move in these directions. So I guess I'm happy I made the choices I did. But I certainly would not say that the people have disappeared, because many of them are highly productive, major figures in the field still today.
To move on a little bit, not only are you an archaeologist, you're an anthropologist, and our field suffers from the culture wars that are going on in this country and have gone on for the last few decades. And departments all across the United States, most recently at Stanford, they've split between those that argue for a scientific, so-called scientific approach to human behavior and those that take a more humanistic view. Where do you see the future of anthropology in the next millennium?
I don't want to talk about millennia, but let's talk about a decade or so.
As we go. Okay. Yeah.
I'm troubled by Stanford because I feel sympathies with both sides of that split, and I can't think that it is doing anyone any good to have divided up in the way they did. Not that I know anything about it in detail. The problems confronting social anthropology, dealing with contemporary communities, are really different than the ones that we confront in archaeology, Tom. In social anthropology, what has come to the fore is a sense of that what can be looked at in detail and understood well is really only the relationship between the investigator and the individuals with whom he or she is dealing. And it's given what I would call, rather pejoratively maybe, a somewhat autobiographical focus to the field that I'm uncomfortable with. On the other hand, one can argue that in fact that is what's available, that is what you can record with any sense of complete honesty. In our case, the problem of relationship with our subjects is a different one, because our subjects have been dead for a long time, and we have no choice but to reconstruct patterns and to do the best job we can of it. So that I think archaeology will always be immune to at least that one major direction of development. I have a feeling that the pattern in social anthropology also is one that can't last, however, because one of the things that it does that concerns me, and I've seen this in my years in Washington, is that it forces people to work in such particularistic detail on the basis of what is today called local knowledge, that they can't really contribute to the formulation of the kinds of policies that countries like our own are going to develop and have to develop. And they can't really participate in the kinds of quantitative evaluation of them that has to go on. And for this reason, anthropologists tend to stand aside from one of the main areas of utility of the social sciences. And I have a feeling that's got to change. It's just a matter of time.
Yeah, I would hope so. We don't see figures like Margaret Mead, who would constantly be on government panels and so on. I'd like to ask you a little bit about your experience at the helm of the Smithsonian. Looking back on it, what were your lasting achievements during your 10 years there?
Well, that's a hard question. I guess I would say without too much hesitation that the launching of the National Museum of the American Indian, which is now going forward, is the one that I feel most warmly about. I think it's a major development in its own right, and I think its a very positive effect on the position of Native Americans in American life is something that will be felt for a long time. But I think also it represents an innovation in the nature of museums that has a lasting place. That's a museum which exists in the closest kind of collaboration with Native American communities, and it's in fact it's a collaborative project, and rather than seeing museum viewers as passive observers who come in and then leave and who take whatever the curators have put out for them and presumably digest it and say nothing about it, it's introducing an interactive style that I think is of vital importance for the future of museums. And I think I was very sympathetic to many forms in which the walls of museums were not coming down completely, of course, but in which we were really trying to show that the authority of curators, or for that matter of scholars, is never absolute. It's always a changing frontier of knowledge, and that it changes in part through the participation of the public, and that certainly the focuses of what is shown, or in exhibits, or for that matter spoken of in books, is something that responds to the problems and interests of the time, and has to. And I think that shift from a much more authoritative, older style of scholarship is something that was going on anyway, but that I think I helped to introduce and intensify in the Smithsonian.
I believe under your watch, large collections of Native American skeletal material was returned to the
process began. It's still continuing. That's not a process which I can say I initiated, in the sense that the concern and even the protest over the existence of these very, very large collections, many of them collected under truly reprehensible conditions from battlefields in the last century and so on, that had been slowly gathering force, and the notion that the native descendants of these individuals in the collections had no rights to their ancestors was in the end found to be intolerable, and I think it was a lesson for me too to discover how wrong our approach had been, and I certainly participated in the changes that took place, but they had powerful support in the Congress and very articulate spokespersons among Native American communities.
Bob, in closing, I'd like to ask you, what are you working on now at UCSD? You were, in the old days, you were actually flying kites with
That was
cameras,
an early form
right?
of air photographs, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And what are you doing now?
Well, today I'm having a ball because now many of the satellite images of past decades, which were highly secret at the time, are being declassified because they have no military significance. And they are liberating in what they make possible in terms of additional studies of exactly the kind that I've been doing before, but with new questions coming to the fore. And I really feel almost as if I landed on a new continent. I'm having a ball.
Wonderful. Well, I'd like to thank you very much and wish you well at UCSD. Our guest tonight has been Professor Robert McC Adams of the Department of Anthropology, UCSD. Good evening.